I keep a pet camera hidden in the dog grooming salon I once owned with my sister-in-law, and the very last video stored on its internal memory shows her laughing at how she forged my signature on a buy-sell agreement worth $500,000. That video got her arrested, stripped her of every dime she had stolen, and today she still washes dogs for me every morning in an apron that blinks the words I stole from my sister-in-law, while custom-engraved collar tags on every single dog that walks out the door read, "Styled by a con." My name is Diana, and this is the story of how a retired nurse used a $30 pet camera, a husband's warning from the grave, and a lockpick made from a bobby pin to dismantle a scheme that would have left me broke, homeless, and marked as a fraudster. I am 53 years old, a widow, and before any of this happened, I had spent 32 years as a registered nurse in the cardiac step-down unit of a busy county hospital in Phoenix. I knew the exact sound of a heparin lock being flushed, the specific weight of a patient's chart after a code, and the way a grieving family looks when they have just been told their loved one is not coming back. My husband, Richard, was a quiet man, a residential architect who specialized in historic restoration, and spent every spare weekend coaxing our 1923 Craftsman back to its original glory, right down to the exact quarter-sawn grain of the Douglas fir window trim. He had a habit of sliding his reading glasses up onto his forehead and forgetting they were there, and he always smelled faintly of sawdust and tung oil. We never had children, but we adopted 3 rescue pit bulls who slobbered on his blueprints and burrowed into my scrubs after every 12-hour shift. Their names are Mabel, Otto, and Clementine, and they were the only witnesses to most of what happened next. 3 months before I discovered the box, Richard collapsed in his workshop while building a custom dog gate from salvaged mahogany and died instantly of a massive coronary. I was at the hospital when they brought him in, still in my scrubs, and I performed the final compression myself out of sheer muscle memory before I realized who was on the gurney. I poured my entire nursing pension, $88,000, into an upscale dog grooming salon because it was the only thing that felt like a future after he was gone. I partnered with my sister-in-law, Madeline, Richard's younger sister, a woman who had spent years managing a high-end pet boutique in Scottsdale, and talked about the dog wash of the future with a breathless conviction that made you overlook the fact she had never once cleaned a kennel in her life. Richard had sketched a logo for me on a napkin once. A pair of shears crossed over a dog bone with the word devotion beneath it, and I gave that name to the salon. It went viral within 8 weeks because a video of me calming a frantic rescue terrier with a low-stress handling technique racked up 2 million views on Instagram, and suddenly we had a 6-week waiting list and franchise inquiries flooding the voicemail. I thought I had built something good, something Richard would be proud of. I had no idea his own sister was already hollowing it out from the inside. Because the estate had been tangled with an outdated will that named both me and Madeline as co-executors, the funeral was delayed by nearly 3 months while lawyers sorted out his various accounts. The morning of the service, I wore a gray dress Richard had always liked and pinned a small sprig of lavender to my collar, because he used to bring me lavender from the garden after every hard shift. Madeline arrived in a black designer suit and spent the entire graveside eulogy texting under her purse. The discovery happened within 24 hours of that funeral. Madeline and her husband Keith, a man who wore Italian loafers without socks and introduced himself as a brand architect, arrived at my house before the last casserole dish had been returned to its neighbor. They said they were here to help me with the transition, a word that already hummed like a corporate restructure. Madeline floated through the rooms with a clipboard, making little check marks, while Keith stood by the window murmuring into his phone about a distressed asset situation, as if I were a remaindered lot. I was still in that heavy fog where grief moves you through water, so I did not object when Madeline announced that she would clear out Richard's study right now because all that old paperwork would be traumatic for you to sort alone. I stood in the doorway and watched her sweep his desk drawers into a black contractor bag, pausing only when she held up a small wooden box no bigger than a loaf of bread. It was cherry wood with a tiny brass clasp, the kind Richard used to keep his grandfather's pocket watch in. She shook it, heard nothing, and said, "Probably just old receipts, toss it." The box landed in the trash bag with a soft, final thud. I remember the exact sound, a muffled little knock that felt like the last closing of a door. An hour later, While they were arguing in the kitchen about whether to order sushi or steak, I pulled the bag back out onto the porch. My hands were moving before my brain had even caught up. The box's corners were still warm from the afternoon sun, and the clasp resisted for just a second before it flicked open with the same precise click Richard's drafting tools always made. Inside there was no watch, only a single sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was his, every letter a neat vertical stroke of an architect's block lettering. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press the envelope against my thigh to open it. Inside was a note on heavy stock that said, "If you are reading this, I am gone. Do not trust my sister. She has been circling our finances since the day we got married. Everything I built for you. Protect it. Save yourself." There was a second sheet, a copy of a trust document that placed the salon's branding, its registered trademark, the lease, the client list, and all the equipment into a special restricted vehicle that could not be transferred without my physical presence, a notary of the bank's choosing, and a live thumbprint verification at a specific branch of Valley Mutual Bank. The document was dated 6 weeks before his death, and the notary seal was crisp. I had never seen this document before. Richard had filed it while I was on night shifts, and he had never said a word. I sat on the porch step for a long time, the paper trembling against my leg, and I understood with a sudden, cold clarity that my husband had been trying to protect me from a predator he knew better than I ever could. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family should never become your first predator. The manipulation started the very next morning, a Saturday, because they did not even wait for the work week. Madeline and Keith sat me down at my own oak dining table and presented a thick white binder labeled Diana's Care Plan, tabbed with colored plastic dividers like a corporate onboarding packet. The tabs read Medical Proxy, Financial Consolidation, and Legacy Transition. They spoke in gentle, practiced tones, the same kind I used to use with dementia patients who needed to be coaxed into swallowing a pill. Madeline explained that the stress of running the salon alone would be too much for a woman in my condition, that she and Keith were prepared to step in and handle everything while I focused on healing. She touched my hand with her cool, dry fingers and said, "Richard would want you to be comfortable, not stressed. Let us carry this for you." There were forms for a durable power of attorney, an assignment of partnership interest, and a transfer of the lease and all intellectual property, each page flagged with a sticky arrow where I was supposed to sign. Keith leaned forward with his elbows on my table and said, "Diana, we only want what Richard would have wanted. Let us take this burden. You'll never have to think about money again. You'll have a monthly allowance and all the dog food you need." The documents would give them 100% control of the business, every dollar of revenue, and the brand I had built. I would be left with a consultant emeritus, title, and no pay, not even the lifetime grooming for my dogs they had originally promised. I read the fine print on the assignment page, and at the bottom, in tiny type, it stated that the signatory waived all claims to the salon's intellectual property in perpetuity. My name would be gone. The low-stress handling protocol I had spent years refining, the one that had drawn 2 million viewers, would belong to them. I remembered the note in my pocket. I let my eyes go soft, let my shoulders slump, and I said, "I just can't think straight right now. Everything is so foggy, like a bad dream. I need a few days to rest before I can even look at paperwork." Madeline's smile flickered at the corner, but she recovered instantly and suggested I come stay in their guest house while I recuperated. They had a beautiful 6-bedroom home in a gated community up in the foothills, with a saltwater pool, a gourmet kitchen, and a full grooming studio attached to the garage where I could still feel connected to the business. She described the guest house as an oasis, a place with soft linens and a view of the mountains where I could heal in peace. Keith nodded and added that he would personally stock the fridge with my favorite mineral water. They made it sound like a spa retreat for the grieving. I knew it was a cage. I also knew I needed to be inside that cage to find the key, so I nodded and whispered, "That sounds so kind." I packed one suitcase, my 3 dogs, and the cherrywood box, and I moved into that luxury prison the very next afternoon. The guest house was attached to the main residence by a short hallway with a door that locked from their side, a small detail I noticed immediately and filed away. The undercover investigation began the moment the guest house door clicked shut. My nursing career had taught me to read vital signs: heart rate, oxygen saturation, the subtle flinch of a patient who is hiding pain. What I needed to read now were financial vitals, and that required a completely different set of senses. The main house was a monument to spending beyond one's means. A sub-zero refrigerator stocked with truffle oil and Wagyu beef, Italian wallpaper that cost more per square foot than my entire first year's salary, and a rotating fleet of leased luxury cars in the drive. The guest house shared a thin wall with the pantry, and the kitchen was Madeline and Keith's informal command center. Every morning at 7:15, they stood by the espresso machine and took calls on speaker before their noise-canceling earbuds went in. I had no sophisticated surveillance gear, just a basic hearing amplifier I had kept from my time assisting ENT surgeons, a tiny gizmo that looked like an old-fashioned hearing aid, but could pick up a whisper through drywall if you pressed the receiver cup against the plaster. I sat on a cushioned stool in that pantry closet every morning, the dogs curled at my feet, and I listened. The amplifier had a small volume dial, and I would adjust it until the voices became crisp, individual words I could log in a tiny pocket notebook I kept inside my bra. Within the first week, I logged 6 different collection calls. Keith would answer with a clipped "Keith here," then immediately drop his voice and say things like, "We've got a major liquidity event coming through in the next 10 days. Just roll the installment." Or, "The asset will be signed over by then, guaranteed. You'll have your principal plus penalties." Once I heard him say, "If you repossess the Mercedes, the whole house of cards falls. I need 2 more weeks." He was juggling personal loans, credit lines, and one very angry auto lender who had threatened repossession of the leased sedan. Madeline's calls were less guarded. She was the type who mistook cruelty for cleverness and talked loud when she thought she was winning. Twice I heard her hiss into the phone, "The old lady is barely functional. I'll have the signature before the week is out. I just need the franchise buyer to hold tight until the notary is greased." The franchise buyer. That was the first time I learned there was someone out there ready to pay cash for the Salon name, method, and client base, and that Madeline intended to sell the bridge I was standing on. I wrote down the phrase, franchise buyer, and circled it. I also heard her make a call to someone she called Hector, telling him, "$1,500 in cash for 10 minutes of work. You just stamp where I point, no questions." A notary for hire. That went into the notebook too. The accident, the one that gave me room to maneuver, happened on day 9. A pipe in the guest bathroom burst because Keith had attempted to install a heated towel rack himself using a YouTube tutorial, a butter knife, and a dangerous disregard for shut-off valves. Water was spraying across the travertine floor, and Keith stood in the hallway screaming at Madeline to call a plumber, while Madeline frantically Googled, "emergency plumber cost near me," and started hyperventilating at the quotes. I walked in wearing my old nursing clogs, turned the shut-off valve behind the toilet with one calm quarter turn, assessed the burst half-inch copper fitting, and said I could fix it. My father had been a master plumber in a small Wisconsin town, and I had spent every teenage summer hauling pipe, sweating joints, and learning to make a compression repair under pressure. He had taught me that a calm hand and the right coupling could fix almost anything. I went to the guest house, retrieved my small toolkit from the suitcase, and returned with a brass compression fitting, a tubing cutter, and a roll of Teflon tape. Within an hour, I had the towel rack detached, the pipe cut clean, a brass compression fitting installed, and the water back on without a single drip. I even wiped down the travertine with an old rag I found under the sink. Keith stared at me as if I had pulled a rabbit out of his Italian leather loafer. Madeline looked annoyed, as if my competence was a personal insult that complicated her narrative of a helpless widow. That afternoon, I overheard her telling Keith through the pantry wall, "She's not as useless as she looks. We need to wrap this up before she starts asking to see bank statements. She fixed a pipe in under an hour. What else can she do?" That comment turned my search inward. I had already noticed the home office door on my first tour, a heavy oak panel with a keypad lock that Keith guarded the way a dragon guards a horde of artificially inflated credit scores. I waited until they left for what Madeline called an investor lunch at a country club they could not afford, and I approached the keypad. I knew residential locks and basic electronic bypasses from years of listening to Richard's detailed explanations of historic restoration, but the keypad was a newer model with a randomized number layout. What I did have was a nurse's attention to pattern and wear. The numbers 2, 5, 7, and 9 had a thin film of oil from repeated pressing, the natural oil from fingertips that gunks up a keypad over time. Using a small LED flashlight from my nursing pen light, I could see the subtle sheen on those 4 digits. After 8 minutes of logic-based guessing, I discovered the code was Richard's birthday in reverse, a detail that hit me like a punch. His birthday was July 25, so the code was 527. Madeline had set this lock using her dead brother's birth date, a tiny buried guilt I would later file away as evidence that she knew exactly whose money she was stealing. The door clicked open, and I slipped inside. The office smelled of leather and expensive cologne over a faint undertone of musty paper. Against the far wall stood a filing cabinet, a sturdy gray steel unit with a Medico high-security lock, the kind Richard once practiced on during our living room lockpicking date nights. He had been obsessed with antique lock mechanisms and had taught me to pick as a form of couples competition, using a set of practice cylinders he built in his workshop. We would sit on the floor with a bottle of cheap red wine, and he would time me as I worked through a succession of progressively harder locks. I learned that a Medico lock uses angled key pins that must be rotated as well as lifted, which makes it a challenge. But Richard had shown me the secret: gentle torque and a very light rake. I carried 2 heavy-duty bobby pins in the seam of my wallet at all times, one bent at a precise 90 degrees to serve as a tension wrench, and the other filed to a sharp, delicate rake tip with a fingernail file. I knelt in front of that cabinet, my knees pressing into the thick wool rug, and I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway. I applied the featherlight clockwise pressure I had practiced 1,000 times, just enough to bind the first pin. Then I began raking the pins with a steady back-and-forth stroke, listening for the tiny clicks that meant a pin had set. The Medico pins rotated with a subtle resistance, and I had to adjust my rake angle twice, but within 45 seconds, the plug rotated with a satisfying, heavy click, and the top drawer slid open. Inside was a disaster of fraudulent documents that felt like a physical blow to my sternum. I found a buy-sell agreement dated 3 weeks after Richard's death, with my signature on the seller's line, written in a near-perfect imitation of the loopy, exhausted cursive I used to sign off on patients' discharge instructions. It stated that I, Diana Aldridge, had agreed to sell my 40% interest in Clip of Devotion to Madeline for $2,000 in cash and services in kind, which I later learned she translated into a gift basket of lavender sachets, stale biscotti, a small bottle of Prosecco, and a card that said, "Thank you for your generous partnership." Next to the buy-sell lay a fat franchise agreement with a national chain called Prestige Pet Suites, an 80-page monster worth $580,000 in upfront payment plus ongoing royalties, contingent on the transfer of all branding, the Salon name, the social media handles, and the secret low-stress grooming protocol I had developed over decades of reading canine stress signals. The agreement specified that the franchisor would own the method outright and could rebrand it as their own proprietary system. My name would be scrubbed from the industry. The closing date was circled in red ink, 14 days from now. Beneath those lay a promissory note that made my blood run cold. Madeline and Keith had taken out a private loan for $200,000 using the Salon's future receivables as collateral, and they had listed me as a co-guarantor without my knowledge. The loan documents included a forged copy of my driver's license, a fraudulent tax return with my name and social security number on it, and a letter of credit that bound my pension residuals. They had already spent the loan money on a down payment for a vacation home in Sedona, and the loan servicing statements showed that if they missed a single payment, the lender could accelerate the entire balance and come after the guarantors. That meant my house, my pension, my bank accounts, my whole future. If the franchise deal did not close and that note went into default, the lender would come after me, my home, every penny of my retirement, and my reputation as a co-signer on a 6-figure fraud. I found also a set of correspondence with the same lender showing that Keith had pretended to be my financial advisor, emailing from a fake address that used my name but a domain he controlled, and had authorized the credit check. My credit report had been pulled without my consent, showing a full financial picture that he used to get the loan. I photographed every page with my phone, careful to capture the dates, the forged signatures, and the account numbers. And then I found the USB drive. It was tucked inside a leather portfolio embossed with Keith's initials, and when I plugged it into my encrypted tablet back in the guest house, I found a folder labeled Salon Footage Backup. The pet camera I had installed in the grooming studio was a simple gray cylinder with a wide-angle lens and a motion-activated SD card that uploaded to a cloud account I thought only I could access. Madeline had apparently downloaded the entire archive of footage, perhaps to review for her own purposes, and the most recent file was a video dated exactly 2 weeks after Richard's funeral. I played it with my thumb hovering over the volume button. It showed the empty grooming studio, the stainless steel tubs gleaming under the track lighting. The door opened, and Madeline walked in with Keith. She was holding a sheaf of documents and a blue ballpoint pen. She laughed, a sharp and brittle sound, and said, "I practiced her signature 100 times on a prescription pad I stole from her nurse's station last year. It looks exactly like her fatigued scribble, all rushed and sloping. She'll never be able to prove it was a forgery, not without a handwriting expert and a small fortune in legal fees. By the time she scrapes together the money, the franchise will be closed and the ink will be dry." Keith replied, "Yeah, well, just make sure the notary you found gets her $1,500. Once the franchise money clears, we're liquid, and that sad little pension of hers is just a rounding error on the next yacht." Madeline then puckered her lips and started mimicking my voice in a high, quavering whine. "Oh, I'm just a poor widow who loves her doggies. Please take everything I have. I don't deserve nice things." They both laughed until their shoulders shook. Keith added, "I'm sending her that gift basket tonight so it looks like a genuine thank you. $2,000 for the sentimental idiot. She'll probably cry and hug it and tell her dogs all about how kind we are." I watched the video 3 times. The first time I felt a hot, liquid rage that made my hands shake. The second time I cataloged the background details, the timestamp, the salon door code visible on the keypad behind them, the exact documents in Madeline's hand. The third time I simply felt a deep, quiet calm. I copied that video file onto 3 separate encrypted drives, one of which I taped inside the battery compartment of my LED flashlight, one I placed behind the baseboard in the guest house closet, and one I kept on my person at all times in a tiny USB drive disguised as a tube of lip balm. That video alone was evidence of forgery, conspiracy to defraud, and fraudulent inducement. But I needed more than a recording. I needed to understand the full structural trap Madeline had built so I could reverse it and walk away clean. That was when I discovered, through a careful reread of Richard's note and the attached trust document, the true shape of the countermeasure my husband had already put in place. The trust document was 17 pages long and written in dense legal language, but certain phrases jumped out. It named Valley Mutual Bank as the trustee of an asset protection trust that held not just the salon's intangible property, but an explicit key person provision. Any attempt to transfer, sell, or encumber the brand, lease, or equipment required the physical presence of the settler's surviving spouse at that very bank branch, an inked thumbprint scanned on a live biometric reader, and a notary selected and paid by the bank directly. The document specified that the biometric reader would cross-reference my thumbprint against the one I had provided during a routine safety deposit box registration years earlier, a fact I had completely forgotten. The buy-sell agreement, the franchise deal, and the promissory note were all legally unenforceable because they lacked this biometric trigger. Madeline had sold Prestige Pet Suites a mirage. She had signed documents that looked official, but without my live thumbprint and presence at Valley Mutual, the trust would refuse to release a single asset. Richard had turned my very identity into a key. I called the bank the next morning and asked to speak with their compliance officer. A woman named Greta Vasquez scheduled me for a private appointment that same afternoon, and I slipped out of the house while Madeline was at a hot yoga class and Keith was on a conference call he was pretending to lead. I left the dogs in the guest house with a recording of Richard's voice reading a poem he loved, playing low on a speaker. Greta was a stocky woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair cut into a no-nonsense bob and eyes that had seen every species of financial predation the Arizona sun could bake up. She wore a navy blazer and sensible flats, and her office was filled with stacks of compliance manuals and a photo of her own rescue greyhound. She pulled up the trust on her monitor, read for 2 solid minutes, and then a slow, satisfied smile spread across her face. "MS, Aldridge," she said, "your husband was a very, very clever man. This trust is a dead man's switch. It's designed so that if you are coerced or absent, the assets are locked down. Any attempt to close the franchise or transfer the assets without your thumbprint will fail. But more importantly, it will trigger an automatic internal fraud alert here at the bank, which we are legally obligated to escalate to the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. The system is automated. The moment someone presents a transfer document with a forged signature and no biometric match, the flag goes up, and our internal security freezes the entire trust and notifies federal authorities. If we can prove intent and coercion, Madeline and Keith are looking at federal charges. Do you have evidence of intent?" I told her about the video, the forged documents, the practice sheets I had photographed with my phone, and the threatening calls I had recorded from the pantry. I played her a snippet of the video on my tablet, and she listened without flinching. Then she leaned forward, steepled her fingers, and said, "Good. We need to let them try to force the transaction. I'll coordinate with the Bureau to stage a signing room here. You will have to walk into that room and let Madeline push you right to the edge, but you must not sign anything. Can you do that?" I told her I had been keeping dying patients calm for 3 decades. I could keep a predator at bay for an hour. Over the following days, with Greta's guidance, I prepared. I solidified the forensic timeline by cross-referencing the bank's security logs with Richard's visit 6 weeks before his death, confirming he had come in person, visibly agitated, and requested the Asset Protection Trust with the biometric lock. The logs showed he had spent 40 minutes with the trust officer, and he had provided a sealed envelope with instructions to open only if I presented his death certificate and my thumbprint. I met a soft-spoken FBI agent named Chen who explained the charge protocol: wire fraud, identity theft, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy. He outfitted my purse with a tiny voice-activated recorder that would stream to a secure evidence locker, and he showed me how to press the hidden button inside my cardigan pocket to alert the backup team. He gave me a card with his direct number and told me to keep it inside my shoe. I rehearsed what I would say, and I also rehearsed staying silent. I practiced maintaining a calm, vacant expression while my heart pounded, the same look I wore during a code when I had to count compressions out loud without betraying panic. The maximum cruelty beat happened the very next Sunday, and it extinguished every flicker of family loyalty I had left. I had spent 3 decades recognizing the precise physical presentation of a myocardial infarction: the sudden clammy sweat, the tingling in the left arm, the crushing substernal pressure that makes a person clutch their chest and gasp. I chose a moment when Madeline and Keith were in the living room reviewing the final franchise contract with a bottle of overpriced champagne they had already opened to celebrate a victory they had not yet won. I walked downstairs, let my breathing become shallow and rapid, let my skin turn waxy, and I collapsed onto the travertine floor with a full-body thud. I had practiced the fall in the guest bathroom, ensuring I would land on my left side to protect my hip while making it look uncontrolled. My right arm twitched once, twice, the way a real dying arm does when the brain is oxygen-starved. I let a thin line of drool gather at the corner of my mouth, and I rasped, "Help me, please. I can't breathe, my chest. It feels like an elephant. Please." Keith stood up and took a step backward, his first instinct pure self-preservation, his eyes scanning the room as if calculating insurance liability. He said, "Is she really doing this now? Is she actually dying on our floor?" Madeline looked down at me from the sofa, her expression flat and unnervingly clinical. She did not rush to me. She did not call for help. Instead, she stepped right over my body, her heel grazing my sleeve, and she snatched the manila folder off the coffee table. She crouched beside me, not to check my pulse, but to press the folder against my limp hand and try to curl my fingers around a pen she had pulled from her own pocket. Her voice was low and urgent, almost a hiss. "If you're going to die, fine, but you're signing this contract first. We cannot let the franchise deal die with you, Diana. This is everything. Just sign it and then you can pass out. Do whatever you want. Just sign." I fumbled my hand toward my pocket where a low-dose aspirin and the FBI recorder rested, and I said, my voice barely a whisper, "You'd let me lie here dying for this." She did not answer. She just bore down harder, her knuckles white, trying to manipulate my slack fingers like a puppeteer. Her nails dug into my skin. I could smell her perfume, something cloying and expensive, mixing with the scent of champagne. Keith finally called 911, but not because he cared. He did it only because Madeline screamed, "If she codes on our floor, we'll be sued before the body's cold, you idiot. The liability alone will wipe us out." He said, "Fine, fine, I'm calling," and he dialed with shaking hands while Madeline kept pressing the pen into my palm. Paramedics arrived 8 minutes later. I let my consciousness surface slowly, blamed a severe panic attack or a transient ischemic attack, and refused transport after they took vitals and found nothing obviously acute. Madeline stood by the front door the entire time, arms crossed, radiating irritation instead of relief. She did not ask the paramedics a single question about my condition. She only asked, when they were packing up, whether they were going to file an incident report and whether it would affect her homeowner's insurance. That evening, alone in the guest house with my dogs pressed against my ribs, I cried for a full hour, not from fear, but from the freezing clarity of having watched a woman step over my possibly dying body to grab a piece of paper. That recording, the one the FBI had captured through my purse, was the final nail I would need. It contained her voice, her words, her kneeling over me with the contract. Agent Chen called me later that night and said simply, "We have enough. Tomorrow we set the trap." The confrontation came 5 days later at Valley Mutual Bank, branch 104, at 10 o'clock in the morning. Greta had arranged the bank's private signing room with the mahogany table, the digital fingerprint scanner, and a hidden button under the desk that would alert the 2 plainclothes FBI agents stationed in the lobby. I wore the limp beige cardigan and worn corduroy slippers that Madeline had laid out for me, my hair deliberately unbrushed, and I let my shoulders stay slumped as they drove me in the leased Mercedes. Madeline patted my knee and said, "Just 2 little signatures, and then you can rest forever, sweetheart. You've been through so much. Richard would be so proud of you for taking care of his family." Keith had arranged the fraudulent notary, a jumpy man named Hector, whom they had paid $5,000 to stamp anything put in front of him without asking a single question. He was already seated at the table, drumming his fingers on a notary stamp that looked authentic, but had a forged commission number. Inside the room, the air smelled of cleaning fluid and toner. Madeline slid the franchise assignment and a fresh buy-sell amendment in front of me with a flourish, her voice dripping with syrupy condescension. "Right here, Diana, sweetie, sign right on the highlighted line, and our friendly notary Hector will witness it. Then we can all go home and I'll pour you a big glass of wine. You've been such a trooper." She placed a blue ballpoint pen next to the paper, the same type she had used in the video. I picked up the pen, felt its weight, and I looked at the dotted line. Then I placed the pen down with a quiet, deliberate click. I said, my voice steady and clear, "I already signed the only document that matters, Richard's love letter to me. He saw you coming, Madeline. He saw you circling before he even got sick. He built a wall out of biometrics and good faith that you cannot forge your way past no matter how many prescription pads you steal." Madeline's face flushed a blotchy, furious red. She slammed her palm on the mahogany so hard the notary jumped. She leaned in and snarled, "Just sign the God-forsaken paper, you pathetic widow, or I will make sure you never see those mangy pit bulls again. I'll have animal control at your guest house door by sundown. I'll tell them you're unfit and those dogs are dangerous. Sign it now." Her spit landed on the document. I looked directly at the surveillance camera in the ceiling corner, the one whose real-time feed Greta and Agent Chen were watching from the back office, and I said, raising my voice slightly, "Greta, now." The heavy door swung inward. Greta Vasquez entered first, a sheet of authorization in her hand, followed by 2 men in Navy FBI windbreakers with badges clipped to their belts, and Miles, the forensic fraud examiner from the bureau, who held an evidence tablet with the video file already queued. I calmly reached into my cardigan pocket, removed my own phone, and pressed play. Madeline's voice, bright and vicious, filled the dead air of that room. I practiced her signature 100 times on a prescription pad I stole from her nurse's station. She'll never prove it was forged. The color drained from Keith's entire body. He looked like a man who had just realized the exit door was sealed. Madeline stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing without sound, her perfectly manicured fingers curling into claws. Hector the notary bolted for the door and was immediately intercepted by the agents. Agent Chen informed Madeline she was under arrest on charges of forgery, fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and elder financial abuse. Keith was similarly cuffed while still babbling about his lawyer. I watched Madeline's wrists get guided behind her back, and I felt no savage joy, only the careful, steel-cut calm of a nurse who had finally stopped a hemorrhage before it bled the patient out. The aftermath proceeded with methodical precision. The franchise deal was voided at the moment the biometric trust lock blocked the transfer, and Prestige Pet Suites, furious at having been duped, filed a civil lawsuit against Madeline for fraudulent misrepresentation. They won a default judgment that seized the Sedona vacation home, liquidated every piece of leased jewelry, and attached future earnings she will never earn. The private lender who had given them the $200,000 came after them personally, and their remaining assets were frozen. Keith accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Madeline, who insisted on a trial despite the mountain of recorded evidence, was convicted on 7 counts and received 7 years with no possibility of parole until she served 85%, plus full restitution of the $88,000 to me, plus an additional $200,000 in damages for the fraudulent loan she attempted to pin in my name. The court also formally recognized Richard's trust and awarded me sole, unencumbered ownership of the salon's name, lease, equipment, and intellectual property. The $2,000 gift basket, which had sat unopened in the guest house, was entered as evidence of the fraudulent payment, and I watched the judge hold up the stale biscotti with a look of pure disbelief. I was made whole, and then some, through the sheer weight of evidence and a dead man's quiet genius. What I did next became local legend, but it was not revenge, it was design. I renamed the salon Clip of Betrayal Grooming, filed the new trademark within 48 hours, and repainted the interior a soft, defiant shade of lavender because I refused to let poison stain a color I love. As part of Madeline's sentencing, the judge ordered her to complete 500 hours of community service, and I petitioned the court, with the help of a letter from my therapist that described the healing nature of animal care and the specific need for restitution through meaningful labor, to have that service performed at the salon under my supervision. The judge, who owned 2 rescue basset hounds and understood the symbolism, approved the arrangement with a barely concealed smile. So every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 8 in the morning, Madeline reports to my salon in her work release uniform, signs a check-in log that includes my name and the salon's full trademark, and then I hand her a custom-designed apron. It is waterproof, sewn with flexible LED panels that scroll bright red letters on a loop. I stole from my sister-in-law. She puts it on without a word, and then she spends her day bathing dogs, brushing matted undercoats, and scrubbing the stainless steel tubs with the same elbows she once tried to rest on my dining table while conning me. Every single dog that walks out of my salon goes home with a custom collar tag, laser engraved in-house with a stylized bone, and the phrase, "styled by a con." Customers bring their dogs in sometimes just to watch Madeline wash them, and the tips are generous, though I donate a healthy portion of those tips to a foundation that helps retired nurses identify and avoid financial predators. The foundation now runs a workshop based on my experience, teaching older women how to spot forgery, read a trust document, and set up their own dead man's switches. My 3 rescue pit bulls nap on an oversized bed in my sunny office now, a bed I built from the exact drawings Richard had sketched on a napkin years ago, the same napkin that had the original salon logo. I keep his cherrywood box on my desk, and sometimes when the day is done and the last dryer has stopped rumbling, I open it and touch the note that saved me. A quiet man who spent his professional life straightening old walls and restoring faded woodwork also in the last weeks of his life, built a fortress I did not know I would need. He left me a warning, and I turned that warning into a lasting lesson the entire neighborhood can watch through the street-facing window every grooming day. Integrity, it turns out, cannot be forged, and boundaries are the only inheritance that some relatives will ever understand. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If this story hit home, please like and subscribe for more tales of how regular people walk through betrayal and come out the other side with their heads high and their dogs freshly groomed. I'll see you in the next one.